Cowboy found Apache wounded near the cliff, and the echo below promised a harsh return. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rugged terrain of the western frontier. A lone cowboy, Jack Dalton, was riding his trusty horse, trotting steadily through the rocky landscape. The day had been long, the heat of the desert sun beating down on him as he scoured the cliffs for any signs of his missing cattle. As he navigated a narrow trail along a steep cliffside, his eyes caught a glimpse of something below. The faint sound of someone calling for help reached his ears. His heart skipped a beat, and his instincts took over. Jack urged his horse forward, riding closer to the edge of the cliff. Down below, a figure lay sprawled on the rocky ground, bleeding from a wound on his side. It was a man, a Native American, with dark hair matted in blood. His clothes were torn, and his face was pale with pain. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he urged his horse down the precarious trail. The man was struggling to move, his eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. Jack dismounted quickly, rushing to the injured man's side. He knelt down beside him, his hands steady as he checked for signs of life. The man's breathing was shallow, but he was still alive. Jack carefully lifted him into his arms, carrying him away from the cliff's edge to a safer spot. The air smelled of dry earth and sagebrush, a harsh reminder of the unforgiving landscape. As Jack gently laid the man down, the figure's eyes fluttered open, locking onto Jack's. For a moment, they stared at each other in silence, the weight of the situation heavy in the air. The man's lips parted, and in a voice barely above a whisper he spoke. "You shouldn't have saved me," he murmured, his voice rough with pain. "My people will never forgive you." Jack frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "I don't understand." The man's gaze hardened for a moment, and he clenched his jaw. "You are white," he said bitterly. "My tribe does not forget. This will cost you." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard stories of the fierce Apache warriors, of the vengeance they sought when their people were wronged. But he hadn't expected it to be like this. He had simply done what anyone would have done. He had saved a life. But now, as the man's words echoed in his mind, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he had just set something into motion that he couldn't control. "I didn't ask for this," Jack muttered under his breath, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver holstered at his side. But he knew it wouldn't help. This was a matter of honor, something much bigger than any gunfight. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of something, or someone. Jack strained his ears, listening carefully. The sound grew louder, and in the distance, he saw shadows moving across the horizon. The Apache man, still lying on the ground, turned his head toward the approaching figures. His eyes widened with terror, and he whispered, "They are coming." Jack looked toward the horizon, his heart pounding as he saw the figures growing clearer, a group of Apache riders, moving fast and with purpose. His mind raced as he realized the danger he was in. The man had warned him, but there was no turning back now. The Apache warriors were coming for him, and nothing could stop the storm that was about to hit. Jack took a deep breath, his hand still resting on the revolver, and glanced down at the wounded man at his feet. This was just the beginning. He had saved a life, but in doing so, he had invited a wrath he might not survive. The echo of his actions was already beginning to reverberate, and the return would be harsh, indeed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the desert in a soft orange glow, Jack Dalton stood still, his eyes fixed on the distant riders. His heart pounded in his chest, the looming threat of the Apache warriors drawing closer with every passing second. The wind carried the dust and the scent of sagebrush, a constant reminder of the unforgiving landscape surrounding him. Jack turned his gaze back to the Apache man, Akachita, who lay wounded on the ground, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of pain and apprehension. Akachita's face was pale, his breathing shallow, but he was still very much alive, despite the severity of his injury. Jack had been in plenty of tough situations before, but this one was different. This was about more than just surviving the day. This was about a choice that would determine his fate. He had never expected to find himself in the middle of a conflict between the Apache and the settlers. But now, standing on the edge of a cliff with the sound of galloping hooves drawing near, Jack realized that his actions had set a chain of events into motion that he couldn't undo. "You don't understand," Akachita muttered, his voice barely audible. "They will not forgive you for this. You saved me, but you've signed your death sentence." Jack knelt beside him, his face grim. "I didn't ask for this," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of frustration. "I just did what I thought was right." Akachita's lips twitched into a faint, bitter smile. "What's right to you may not be right to them. My people live by different rules." The sound of hooves grew louder, and Jack could see the dust rising in the distance, a clear sign that the Apache warriors were closing in. A feeling of dread settled in his gut, but he knew there was no escaping the confrontation now. He had to stand his ground, not just for himself, but for the man he had saved. "We need to get you to safety," Jack said, trying to hide the unease in his voice. "Can you walk?" Akachita shook his head, his strength fading fast. "No. But they won't spare me if they catch you." Jack hesitated for a moment, weighing his options. The warriors were getting closer, and he knew that running wasn't an option. If he tried to flee, the warriors would catch him in minutes, and Akachita's fate would be sealed. Jack's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. The sound of the Apache warriors was almost upon them now. He had no time to think. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle slung across his back, and he gripped it tightly, the weight of the weapon offering him a small sense of reassurance. But deep down, Jack knew that no amount of firepower would stop the Apache warriors once they made up their minds. He could only hope that Akachita's people would honor the debt of gratitude he had unknowingly earned. As the first riders appeared at the edge of the cliff, their figures silhouetted against the fading light of the day, Jack stood up, his heart beating fast. He placed a hand on Akachita's shoulder, steadying him. "Stay with me," Jack said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. "I'll do what I can to make this right." Akachita looked up at him, his expression unreadable. "You don't understand," he whispered again. "You can't outrun what's coming." The first Apache warrior dismounted and approached them, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "You saved him?" the warrior asked, his voice low but filled with authority. Jack nodded slowly, his grip tightening on his rifle. "I did." The warrior's gaze flicked to Akachita, who was barely conscious, and then back to Jack. "You're brave, white man. But bravery doesn't change the past." Jack's jaw clenched as the warrior motioned for the rest of the riders to circle around him. The weight of the situation was beginning to sink in, and Jack knew that the decisions made in the next few moments would either lead to his survival or his demise. Akachita's words echoed in his mind. "You can't outrun what's coming." As the Apache warriors closed in, Jack realized that his fate, and the fate of Akachita, was no longer in his hands. The choices they had made had set them on a path that would be hard to change. And as the last rays of sunlight disappeared over the horizon, Jack understood that the return promised by the echo below would be harsh indeed. The Apache warriors circled Jack and Akachita, their eyes fixed with an intensity that made the air feel heavy, like a storm was about to break. Jack stood firm, his rifle in hand, but the uncertainty weighed on him. A sudden realization settled over him. This was not just a fight for survival, it was a test of honor, a test that would decide whether he would live or die in these harsh lands. As the leader of the Apache riders approached, his eyes never leaving Jack, the silence between them stretched long and unbearable. The warriors had made no move, but the tension in the air was thick with anticipation. "You saved him," the leader said, his voice deep and measured, carrying the authority of a man who had lived through countless battles. Why? Jack swallowed, his grip tightening on his rifle. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Because it was the right thing to do, Jack said, his voice steady but carrying a hint of uncertainty. I didn't know who he was or what he meant to your people, but he was dying. I couldn't just leave him there. The leader's gaze softened, though his face remained stoic. You believe in doing what is right, even when it brings danger to your doorstep. Jack nodded, unsure of where this conversation was leading but knowing that his answer was the only one that could save him. Yes, I do, he said firmly. The leader seemed to study him for a moment, his piercing eyes searching Jack's face for any sign of deceit. Finally, he nodded slightly. Perhaps you are not like the others, he said. But saving one of us comes at a price. Jack's stomach tightened. The words hung in the air like an invisible thread, and the echo of Akachita's warning came rushing back into his mind. What price? Jack asked, though he feared the answer. The leader motioned to the other riders, and they dismounted, surrounding Jack and Akachita. The price is not just your life, white man, the leader said. It is the honor of your people, your willingness to stand against the tide of your own kind. Jack's heart sank, realizing that his act of kindness had drawn him into something far larger than he could have imagined. And what does that mean? Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. The leader's lips parted, but instead of words, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. He held it out to Jack, and as Jack took it, the cloth fell away to reveal a small, intricately carved pendant. The leader's eyes met Jack's. This is a token of our people. It is a sign of both gratitude and warning, he said. Take it, and you carry the weight of our trust and our judgment. Jack stared at the pendant, its design unfamiliar but beautiful, as if it held the weight of generations in its delicate shape. I don't understand, Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. The leader's face hardened once more. You will. The Apache people do not forget those who cross us. You will be watched, and your actions will decide whether this token becomes a gift or a curse. Jack's mind raced. He had expected a fight, perhaps retribution for saving Akachita, but not this. A token of judgment? What did it mean for him and for Akachita? Before he could ask more, the leader turned, signaling to his warriors. You have been spared for now, he said. But the return, white man, will come when you least expect it. And it will be harsh. With that, the Apache leader and his riders mounted their horses and rode off, leaving Jack standing there, the pendant heavy in his hand. Akachita, still lying on the ground, looked up at Jack, his expression unreadable. You have saved me, Akachita said softly, but you have also invited the wrath of my people. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. The weight of the pendant in his hand seemed to grow heavier with every passing moment. He had saved a life, but the cost of that act was only beginning to unfold. Jack turned his gaze to the horizon, where the Apache warriors had disappeared, and he wondered what kind of storm he had just unleashed. The sun had set, and the cold night air seemed to carry with it the promise of something far more dangerous than any enemy he had ever faced. A storm was coming, and Jack had no idea how to prepare for it. All he knew was that the echo of his actions had already begun, and the return would be harsh indeed. Jack Dalton rode through the silent night, the weight of the pendant still hanging heavy in his pocket. He had never imagined that a single act of kindness would lead to such dire consequences. As the stars above twinkled in the vast desert sky, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he had stepped into a world far beyond his understanding. The Apache warriors were gone, but their presence lingered like a shadow, creeping closer with each passing minute. Jack's mind raced with the implications of the leader's words. The return will come when you least expect it, and it will be harsh. He had no idea when, or how, that return would manifest, but he could feel it coming. The night air was cooler now, and the only sound was the rhythmic clip-clop of his horse's hooves against the rocky path. Akachita, still lying injured in the makeshift camp Jack had set up, hadn't said much after the Apache warriors had left. His eyes were closed, and his breathing had slowed, but Jack knew the danger was far from over. He could still hear Akachita's words echoing in his mind. "You have saved me, but you have also invited the wrath of my people." Jack had been a cowboy for most of his life. He had dealt with the harsh realities of the frontier, but nothing had prepared him for this, saving a man only to become a target for his entire tribe. Jack had always lived by a simple rule: help those in need, no matter the cost. But now, standing in the desert with an injured Apache warrior, Jack realized that some costs were more than he had bargained for. The cold night seemed to press in around him, the mountains towering on either side. He looked at Akachita, who was still unconscious, and felt a pang of guilt. Was this really worth it? Was one life worth the wrath of an entire people? Jack shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside. There was no time for doubt now. He had made his choice, and he had to stand by it. As the fire crackled beside them, Jack stood up, gazing out over the canyon. The distant stars shone brightly, but they did little to calm the storm brewing inside him. He couldn't help but think about the Apache leader's words. "You will be watched, and your actions will decide whether this token becomes a gift or a curse." Jack took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew the warriors would return, and when they did, there would be no escape. He had to be ready, whatever that meant. As the hours passed, Jack remained vigilant. He couldn't afford to sleep, not with the threat of the Apache warriors looming over him. He glanced back at Akachita, whose injuries were still grave. There was no telling how much longer he would survive without proper care, and Jack knew that if Akachita died on his watch, the consequences would be even worse. The wind began to pick up, carrying with it the scent of rain. Jack pulled his jacket tighter around him, trying to keep warm, but the chill in the air wasn't the only thing that made him shiver. The uncertainty gnawed at him. He had saved Akachita, but now what? What had he truly done? Had he made a difference, or had he merely set the stage for something far more dangerous? Jack's mind raced as he considered the possible outcomes. He knew that the Apache would not forget what had happened. They were a proud people, bound by honor and tradition. A debt had been owed, and it had been paid with Jack's actions. But the question remained, would the Apache see it as a debt repaid, or would they come for him, seeking retribution for the bond he had formed with one of their own? As the night wore on, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was coming. He could feel it in his bones, in the air around him. And when it came, he knew it would be harsh. The winds howled through the canyon, and Jack tightened his grip on his rifle, ready for whatever lay ahead. The first sign of dawn appeared on the horizon, the faintest hint of light creeping over the mountains. Jack's heart beat faster as he scanned the landscape, his senses on high alert. He didn't know when the Apache would come, but he knew that when they did, everything would change. Jack turned to Akachita, whose eyes fluttered open just as the first rays of sunlight touched the earth. Akachita looked up at him, his expression weary but grateful. "You saved my life," Akachita whispered, his voice hoarse. "But now you must face the consequences." Jack nodded, knowing that Akachita's words held more truth than he could fully understand. The time for running was over. The return had begun. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale glow across the barren land. Jack Dalton stood watch, his hands still gripping his rifle, his eyes scanning the desolate landscape. The air was still and cold, the wind whispering through the rocks and sagebrush, but Jack could feel something was different now. The Apache were coming, and there was no way to avoid them. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned toward the small fire where Akachita lay, the Apache warrior's wounds still severe but manageable. Akachita had managed to stay awake, his eyes focused on the approaching sunrise, his expression unreadable. Jack's mind raced, trying to think of the next move. He had saved Akachita's life, but now he was bound by a promise he didn't fully understand. Would the Apache honor his act of kindness, or would they see it as an insult, a betrayal? The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Jack glanced over his shoulder, his instincts telling him that something was about to happen. He couldn't shake the feeling that the Apache were closing in, their presence growing stronger with every passing second. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble, and he could hear the faint sound of hooves in the distance. Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. Akachita stirred slightly, his voice hoarse as he spoke. "They are coming," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "They will come for you. They will not forget this." Jack nodded, his throat dry. "I know," he replied, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up on him. "But there's nothing I can do now. I've already made my choice." The distant sound of hooves grew louder, and Jack's heart raced. The Apache were nearing, and Jack knew that whatever was about to happen would change everything. He had no illusions about the danger he was in. He had saved Akachita, but in doing so, he had unknowingly set himself on a path toward a reckoning. The ground was rough beneath his boots as Jack moved closer to Akachita, his eyes searching the distant mountains for any sign of movement. He could see nothing but the vast expanse of wilderness, but the feeling in his gut told him the Apache were near. Akachita shifted slightly, his eyes closing as if he were bracing himself for something inevitable. "You cannot run," Akachita said, his voice barely a whisper. "They will find you, no matter where you go. You will be marked by your actions." Jack took a deep breath, his mind swirling with uncertainty. He had never imagined that a simple act of kindness could lead to such an outcome. All he had done was save a man's life, but now it seemed as if he had inadvertently stepped into a war he had no understanding of. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain, and the tension in the air grew unbearable. Jack could feel the weight of the pendant in his pocket, the small token that had been given to him by the Apache leader. It seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, as if it were alive with the promise of something to come. The first Apache rider appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the rising sun. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he saw the rest of the warriors following behind him, moving in perfect formation. They were coming for him, just as Akachita had said. Jack's hand instinctively reached for his rifle, but he knew it wouldn't matter. There was no escaping what was about to happen. The Apache riders approached, their horses moving in synchronized strides. Jack's mind raced, but there was no time for thoughts. The moment had arrived. He had made his choice. He had saved Akachita's life, but now he would face the consequences of that decision. The Apache warriors dismounted, their eyes fixed on Jack. The leader, the same man who had given him the pendant, stepped forward, his gaze cold and calculating. "You have saved one of our own," the leader said, his voice low and controlled. "But you must understand that this comes at a cost." Jack stood tall, his heart pounding in his chest as he looked the Apache leader in the eye. "I understand," he said, his voice steady. "But what do you want from me?" The leader paused for a moment, his eyes studying Jack. "What we want from you," he said, "is your respect. You have shown kindness, but we cannot let this act go unpunished. You will not be left unscathed." Jack's breath caught in his throat as he realized what the leader meant. He had saved Akachita, but now he had to pay the price for his actions. The leader nodded to his warriors, and they moved in closer, surrounding Jack. He had done what he could to survive, but now he understood the harsh truth. There would be no easy way out. The Apache had come, and the return had begun. The Apache leader studied Jack intently, his gaze sharp and unwavering. Jack could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The air was thick with tension, and every warrior's presence seemed to close in on him. The leader took a slow step forward, his leather boots crunching against the dry earth. Jack stood tall, his heart racing, but his resolve held firm. He had never expected things to escalate like this, but now there was no turning back. "You saved one of ours," the leader said, his voice low but clear. "And for that, you have earned our respect. But respect comes with a price." Jack's grip on his rifle tightened, but he kept his stance steady. He had already made the decision to help Akachita, and now, no matter the cost, he would face the consequences. The leader paused, studying Jack's expression. "You think we are like your kind?" he continued, that we can be bought with gold or promises. But we are not like you. We live by different codes. Our actions, our choices, they are bound by the land, the spirits, and honor. Jack's chest tightened as he listened. This was no ordinary confrontation. This was about something deeper, something older than any of them. I understand, Jack said, his voice calm but laced with the tension that had been building inside him. I didn't do this to buy your forgiveness or your trust. I saved Akachita because it was the right thing to do. But I know that there are consequences for every action. The leader regarded him quietly for a long moment. Then, to Jack's surprise, the man nodded once, almost imperceptibly. You speak the truth, he said. But truth alone does not change the past. You will carry the weight of this choice for as long as you live. The words sank in. Jack had always believed that doing what was right meant standing firm in the face of adversity, but he had never considered that the price for doing so could be so high. A soft, barely audible sound caught Jack's attention. He turned to see Akachita, still lying on the ground, his face pale, but his eyes were open and alert. The Apache warrior's gaze met Jack's, and for the first time, Jack saw something resembling gratitude in his eyes. You saved me, Akachita whispered, his voice hoarse but sincere. You did what was right, and for that, you will be forever marked. But know this, there is no escape now. Jack's heart sank as he understood the gravity of Akachita's words. There was no escaping the consequences, no running from the choices he had made. The leader turned away from Jack and motioned for his warriors to follow him. As they began to move, he glanced back over his shoulder. The price will be paid in full, white man, he said. The land remembers, and so do we. With that, the Apache warriors began to mount their horses, preparing to leave. Jack stood frozen, the weight of their words echoing in his mind. Akachita's voice reached him once more, barely a whisper. They will come again, he said. And when they do, you will have to face what you have done. Jack nodded slowly, his mind racing as the reality of the situation began to sink in. He had saved Akachita, but in doing so, he had unknowingly become a part of something much larger. The Apache had shown him their respect, but that respect had come at a cost. A cost that Jack didn't yet fully understand. As the Apache riders disappeared into the distance, Jack turned to look at Akachita, who had closed his eyes again, clearly exhausted from the ordeal. Jack took a deep breath and looked out over the vast, empty landscape. The wind had picked up again, carrying with it the scent of the desert, and the promise of something far more dangerous. Jack knew that the Apache would return, and when they did, he would be ready. For now, all he could do was wait, and prepare for whatever came next. The echo of his choices had already begun, and Jack knew that the harsh return would come sooner than he expected. The days that followed were filled with an unsettling silence. Jack Dalton kept watch over the small camp, his thoughts racing as he tried to prepare himself for whatever was to come. The Apache had warned him, and the weight of their words hung heavily on his shoulders. Akachita's condition had improved, but the man still needed care, and Jack had no way of knowing how long they had before the Apache would return. Every sound in the wind, every rustle of leaves, made Jack's senses sharpen. His rifle was always within reach, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. He had done what he believed was right, but now he was uncertain whether that decision would be his undoing. As the sun set behind the jagged cliffs, casting long shadows across the land, Jack sat beside the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance. He had lived alone for so long, but now the isolation felt different. The silence was oppressive, the stillness broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire or the distant howl of a coyote. Akachita had fallen into a deep sleep, his wounds bandaged but still painful. The man stirred occasionally, but his eyes remained closed. Jack knew that they couldn't stay here for long. If the Apache returned, they would have no chance of escaping. He had saved Akachita's life, but now he wondered if it had been a mistake. The Apache were not known for mercy. Jack had heard the stories of warriors who would stop at nothing to avenge wrongs, real or perceived. And yet, despite the danger, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. A life had been in danger, and he had acted. That was all that mattered. But as the hours dragged on, Jack felt a gnawing sense of unease. The weight of his actions, of the promise he had made to Akachita, hung over him like a dark cloud. He knew the Apache would return, but he didn't know when. The uncertainty was unbearable. It wasn't until the next morning that Jack got his first real sign of what was to come. The wind had shifted overnight, bringing with it a strange chill. Jack stood at the edge of their camp, staring out over the canyon. The stillness was gone now, replaced by the sense that something was moving just beyond the horizon. His instincts told him that the Apache were near. His heart pounded as he scanned the landscape, his eyes searching for any sign of movement. The sun had barely risen, and the world was still bathed in the soft light of dawn. It was a beautiful morning, but the beauty only made Jack feel more uneasy. He knew that the calm would be short-lived. A voice called out from behind him. "We are not alone." Jack turned to find Akachita standing, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch. His face was pale, but his eyes were clear, sharp with awareness. "The Apache are close," Akachita said, his voice low. "They will not be satisfied until they have paid their debt." Jack nodded, the weight of Akachita's words sinking in. He had known this was coming, but hearing it from Akachita made it all too real. The Apache were coming, and Jack had no idea how he would survive the encounter. Akachita took a step forward, his movements slow but steady. "You saved me," he said. "But that is not enough to protect you. You must face them, and you must face the consequences of your actions." Jack swallowed hard. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't know what they want from me." Akachita looked at him, his expression somber. "They want what they are owed," he said. "And if you have any hope of surviving, you must stand your ground. You must show them that you are not afraid." Jack stood in silence for a moment, contemplating the gravity of Akachita's words. He had saved a life, but now he was about to face the cost. The Apache would come, and when they did, Jack knew that he would either be claimed by their wrath or by his own courage. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "I'll stand," Jack said, his voice steady now. "I'll face whatever comes." As he spoke the words, Jack realized that he had no choice. The Apache were coming, and he would have to face them. There was no running, no hiding. His actions had already set the course, and now it was time to face the consequences. Jack turned his gaze back to the horizon, the rising sun casting its golden light across the land. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that he was ready. The Apache were coming, and Jack Dalton would not turn away. He would stand and face whatever they brought. The echo of his choices was already being felt, and the harsh return was fast approaching. The wind was colder now, sweeping across the canyon like a warning. Jack Dalton stood at the edge of the cliff, his eyes scanning the horizon, his heart thudding in his chest. He had made his decision, but now that decision was leading him toward an uncertain fate. The Apache had come for him. The time to run had passed. All he could do now was stand and face whatever would come. Akachita, still struggling with the pain of his wounds, had gathered enough strength to sit up. He was silent, watching Jack as the cowboy prepared for the inevitable. "You must be ready," Akachita said quietly, his voice weak but firm. "The Apache will not hesitate. You are not a guest to them anymore. You are part of the tribe's story, whether you like it or not." Jack didn't respond immediately. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, he was lost in his thoughts. He had always prided himself on making the right choices, but now he realized that even the right choice could lead to consequences far beyond what he could control. "I know," Jack finally said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. "But there's no going back." Akachita nodded slowly, his gaze shifting toward the horizon where the faintest movement could be seen. "The warriors are close," he murmured. "They will come, and they will want answers." Jack tightened his grip on his rifle, his mind racing. There had been no clear answer for what to do now. A part of him wanted to run, to escape while he still could. But another part, the part that had made him save Akachita in the first place, knew that fleeing was not the answer. He had made a promise, and now he had to face the consequences. The distant sound of hooves reached his ears, growing louder by the second. Jack could feel his pulse quicken as the riders drew closer. His body tensed, every muscle ready for whatever would come next. But even as he braced himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had no control over what was happening. The Apache were here, and they would do what they had to do. Jack and Akachita were only two pieces in a much larger game. The sound of hooves grew louder, until finally, the first Apache warrior appeared at the crest of the hill. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he saw the rest of the riders following behind, moving with the precision of a well-organized force. There were no words exchanged as the Apache warriors approached. They rode in silence, their faces unreadable beneath their war paint, their eyes focused on Jack. The leader of the Apache, the same man who had given him the pendant, was at the front, his expression hard as stone. He dismounted with practiced ease, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. Jack stood his ground, refusing to show any sign of fear. He knew what was coming, but he wasn't going to back down now. The leader's eyes met Jack's, and for a moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of the moment hanging heavy between them. "You saved one of ours," the leader said finally, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "And for that, you will be remembered. But there is still a price to pay." Jack's stomach churned, but he held his ground. "I did what I thought was right," he said, his voice steady. "But I know there will be a price. What is it that you want from me?" The leader studied him for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. Then, with a slow nod, he motioned for the other warriors to dismount. They formed a circle around Jack and Akachita, their eyes trained on the cowboy. "What we want," the leader said, "is not your death, but your understanding. You saved one of us, but that does not mean you are free from our ways." Jack's heart raced as the weight of the leader's words sank in. The Apache were not here to kill him, but that didn't mean they were done with him either. The leader stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You have earned our respect," he said, "but now you must prove that you understand the cost of your actions." Jack nodded slowly, unsure of what the leader meant. "How?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The leader reached into his cloak and pulled out a small pouch, handing it to Jack. The pouch was heavy, its contents unknown, but the leader's eyes burned with intensity. "You will carry this with you," the leader said. "And when the time comes, you will understand its purpose." Jack took the pouch, his fingers brushing against the rough fabric. He had no idea what was inside, but the leader's words carried a weight that sent a chill down his spine. "When the time comes," the leader repeated, "you will know what to do." Jack tucked the pouch into his coat, his heart pounding in his chest. The Apache warriors mounted their horses, their eyes still fixed on him as they began to ride off. Jack stood in silence, the leader's words echoing in his mind. He had no idea what the future held, but one thing was clear: the Apache had marked him, and whatever was to come, Jack would face it with the consequences of his actions hanging over him. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the promise of something yet to come. Jack turned back to Akachita, who had watched the entire exchange with quiet intensity. "What happens now?" Jack asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. Akachita looked at him, his face unreadable, before he spoke. "No," he said softly. "We wait for the return. And when it comes, you will know what to do." The words hung in the air like a warning, and Jack knew that the storm was far from over. Days passed in a quiet, tense rhythm. Jack Dalton could feel the weight of the Apache leader's words pressing down on him like an unspoken promise. The pouch the leader had given him sat heavy in his coat pocket, its contents a mystery that Jack was not sure he was ready to understand. Akachita's condition continued to improve, though slowly. He no longer needed as much help, but the silence between them felt more suffocating with each passing day. The wind had picked up, and the once still desert landscape now hummed with an unsettling energy. Every gust seemed to carry with it a warning, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the Apache were still watching, waiting for him to make the next move. Jack tried to keep busy, tending to the camp, checking on Akachita, and making sure their few supplies were enough to last. But every time he returned to the fire, the pouch in his pocket seemed to grow heavier, as though it were a physical weight pulling him down. He had no idea what it held, but he knew that whatever it was, it had been entrusted to him for a reason. The distant cry of a hawk echoed through the canyon, a sound that seemed to pierce the silence of the landscape. Jack glanced up toward the sky, but the bird was already gone, lost among the vast stretches of the desert. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the camp, and Jack felt the familiar chill of nightfall creeping in. Akachita had fallen asleep once again, his face calm but weary, and Jack took this moment to step away from the camp. He needed to clear his head. As he walked through the rocky terrain, the soft crunch of his boots on the earth seemed like the loudest sound in the world. His thoughts were muddled, and the weight of the Apache's expectations hung heavily on him. What did they want from him? Was the respect they had given him truly worth the price he would eventually pay? Jack didn't know the answer. He didn't know what it meant to stand with the Apache or what the return would bring. But he knew one thing: he couldn't undo what he had done. He had saved Akachita's life, and that had set this chain of events in motion. And now, with the Apache warriors gone, Jack found himself alone with nothing but the sound of the wind and the weight of a decision that had already been made. He stopped at the edge of a cliff, looking out over the vast expanse of the desert below. The sky was darkening, and the first stars began to appear, faint pinpricks of light against the deep blue canvas. The silence was deafening, and for the first time in days, Jack felt a flicker of peace. But that peace was fleeting. He could still hear the echoes of the Apache leader's voice in his mind. The return would come, and when it did, Jack would have to face it. There was no turning back. The rustling of leaves behind him broke his thoughts, and Jack turned to find Akachita standing there, his expression unreadable. "You are troubled?" Akachita said softly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen much more than a man like Jack could understand. "The warriors will return, and you must face them. But know this, you have already made your choice, and now you must honor it." Jack felt a cold shiver run through him, but he didn't look away from Akachita. "I know," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty that still gnawed at him. "I've already made my choice. But I don't know what that means, what I'm supposed to do." Akachita regarded him silently for a moment before stepping closer. "What it means," he said, "is that you must stand for what you believe in, no matter the cost. The Apache live by the code of honor. You saved me, but now you must live with the consequences of that act." Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry as the desert air. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that," he said quietly. Akachita gave him a long, searching look. "Strength is not always about power, Jack Dalton. It is about knowing when to fight and when to accept what comes. You have already fought for me. Now you must face what comes next." Jack nodded slowly, understanding the weight of Akachita's words. The time to run was over. The Apache would return, and when they did, Jack would have to stand and face whatever they had in store for him. He turned back to the camp, where the fire was still burning low. He wasn't ready for what was coming, but he knew there was no way to avoid it. The echo of his choices had already been set into motion, and the storm was on the horizon. The return was coming, and Jack Dalton would have to face it, whatever the cost.